So now let's talk about microservices architecture, and this is an architecture style that is currently very popular. So basically in the beginning, we had client-server architecture. Again, we had the client computers and the servers, and they communicated with each other. Then people realized, it was better to go out and basically use different vendors' services. So SendGrid, Twilio, Box, that type of deal. And so you could have your Python code that would connect to those services in order to send emails and deal with files and all that kind of stuff. Well, the issue is, as time goes by, right, we get larger and larger companies, and they realize that service-oriented architecture is a great idea, but for whatever reason, they're concerned about sending all of this information out to these different vendors, right? They're sending information to an AI vendor, they're sending information to an SMS vendor, and there's a whole question about security and privacy and that type of deal. And so they say, hey, what if we use the same idea as service-oriented architecture, but basically we own it all? Right? And so basically what you get with microservices architecture is where companies design the architecture style for their internal systems based off of services, right? So if you have a lot of different development teams, right? So your developers might be developing a lot of different projects. Now, all of those different projects might need email services, but you don't want the developers to have to worry about the email server and that type of thing. So what happens is internally, they will create an email service. So this is different than an email server because basically it'll still use an API call, but it will be internal to the company. All of these different projects can then communicate with that service in order to be able to send emails out. The valuable part about this is even though the company controls the server and somebody does have to manage the service and all that kind of thing, if they want to swap over to a different product, then it's relatively easy to do, right? So if currently, let's say right now, they're using a Microsoft file server, they're using Microsoft file services. If they turn that into a service so that all of these different projects are able to connect with, and then they realize, you know what, Linux would be better. What they can do is they can then spin up a Linux server or a Linux solution. On that Linux solution, they can create the API connections that are identical to what the Windows server has, so that then basically all they can do is they can turn off the Windows services, bring up the Linux services, and then the API calls are able to communicate with the file service that is now being run off of Linux. So basically when we're talking about microservices architecture, it's taking the concept of service-oriented architecture, which is outside vendors that your code is communicating with, and basically bringing those in-house so that you have services that you can swap out and that type of thing, but they're actually controlled by the company. So let's imagine you're working for a company and your company is creating a number of different solutions, right? So let's say you're creating a CRM solution, customer relationship management solution. Let's say you're doing an invoice solution. Let's say you're doing a marketing solution. And let's say you're doing some kind of sales call solution, right? So basically you have different developers working on these different projects, and these different projects are going to need the same types of resources. So again, imagine they're all going to need email services. Now the thing is, you don't want to tightly bind any of the things that you're creating to a particular server. You don't want to bind them to Exchange server. You don't want to bind them to some other solution. You just want to be able to do an API call. So you want your code to be able to do an API call to communicate with the solution, and that's it. So whether it's Exchange on the back end, or whether it's a Linux box on the back end, or whether it's a potato on the back end, it doesn't really matter to you or to the different projects. You just want them to be able to do an API call, right? So this is where you would create an email solution, and that would have its own servers and it would have its own resources and all that kind of thing. And basically you would just have this API that would be available so that these different projects would be able to communicate with the API itself to get the email solutions. Again, you might get something like identity management. That's a big one now, especially for security. So your CRM solution needs to know who's interacting with it, your invoice solution, your marketing, your sales solution. When some user is interacting with any of these, you need to identify them to make sure they're getting access to the appropriate resources. So basically, you can have identity management. Again, you can have an API connection to this, and then the different projects that you're creating can then connect to that API for identity management to identify who is connecting to that particular solution. The good thing is, again, identity management is one of those areas right now where a lot of different products are coming out. So on the back end of identity management, if you decide this product isn't working the way you want it to, you want to use a different identity management solution, you can just simply change out that back end. As long as the API remains the same, all of the services will keep functioning properly and you won't run into any issues. And so basically this is the idea with microservices architecture. It's taking the concept of service-oriented architecture and bringing it in-house into your own systems. So that's the basic idea with microservices architecture. The benefit is that it gives you a lot of flexibility with how you design your architecture. And if you need to swap out different products, it makes it easy from a maintenance standpoint because you can just swap those products out of the back end as long as the API remains the same. The systems that communicate with that service shouldn't have any issues. The issue, on the other hand, though, from an organizational standpoint, is you are now bringing that maintenance load back in-house, right? So when you have client-server architecture, the client and the server is tightly bound together, and you basically own all of that. Right? So that creates an issue if you need to do a migration, if a CPU fan fails, that type of deal. So we went with service-oriented architecture. The idea is you don't own any of it. You're simply doing an API call up to those services. The issue is that could get very expensive at scale, and there's a security concern, right? Whenever you're sending data outside of your network, you really have no idea what the other party is doing with that. You might be a little concerned there. So microservices is like, hey, what if we bring this back in-house so we have a lot of different products that are able to communicate with this service, right? So we have that service-oriented architecture. If we need to swap out the back end, we can do that relatively easily. From a security standpoint, we know where all of our data is going. It's going to that particular service. But on the other hand now, your company is now responsible for the service, for the servers and the resources and everything that's required to make that service function. So that's one of the things to be thinking about with microservices architecture. It can be a great way for building things out, but you do have to make sure you consider the resources that will be required and the cost to your organization.